Today we have the pleasure to have with us Gerhard Toews and Pierre-Louis Vézina. Pierre-Louis is going to deliver the presentation of their joint paper, Enemies of the People, but Gerhard, being online with us, can handle questions via the Q&A function, or if he prefers, just contribute directly to an answer that Pierre-Louis is providing. This is up to you how you want to divide the work. So Pierre-Louis, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. And thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to be here to present our paper, Enemies of the People. So let me start with the title. You might have heard this expression recently. You might have heard the previous president of the US use it to describe the media. It's actually an old expression that dates to Roman times, but in this paper, we focus on the Soviet Union. So let me start with this quote from Lenin from 1917. "No mercy for these enemies of the people. War to the death against the rich and their hangers-on, the bourgeois intellectual." And then 20 years later, this other guy, "Whoever tries to break the unity of the socialist state is a sworn enemy of the state, of the peoples of the USSR, and we will destroy any such enemy." So who did they have in mind? Who were they referring to when using enemies of the people? They actually had a specific group in mind, and that was the educated elite. Okay, that included engineers, lawyers, doctors, academics, etc. And they were thought of as a threat to the Soviet regime. And for this reason, they were sent to forced labor camps scattered across the Soviet Union, a system known as the Gulag, okay, or often referred to as the Gulag Archipelago, like a chain of islands spread across the territory. 3 million enemies of the people were spread across these camps out of a total of more than 12,000 prisoners. What are we going to do in this paper? We're going to look at the long-run effects of this forced relocation of enemies of the people, okay, on prosperity today across Russia. So you can think of our paper as a natural experiment that allows us to examine the effect of education as embedded in forced migration on prosperity today. So there are some similar papers in the literature that look at the effect, the long-run effect of migration as migrants take their human capital with them. Okay, so you might know these papers about Argentina and Brazil, where European settlers went to different places across the countries, and where there were more European settlers who were more educated, you have higher levels of schooling today and higher income per capita. Yeah, another famous example is the Huguenots, or the refugees from France, some of which ended up in Prussia, and they brought with them their technical knowledge about textile manufacturing, which increased productivity in their new homes in Prussia as they brought this knowledge with them. There's other examples about farmers in Brazil or about ethnic deportation in the Soviet Union, when deportees take their culture with them, diffuse their culture by being deported. So some similar papers, so you can wonder, what can we learn from this example about the enemies of the people? Well, what we think of as our first contribution is to tell you about this story about the enemies of the people and the Gulag more generally, and look at its effect in the long run. You can also think of it as a natural experiment. So here we have forced migration spread across the territory. And because these are forced, you have no self-selection into migration. And obviously you don't have the enemies of the people do not decide where they go, so you have no endogenous location decisions. At the same time, you don't have strategic location decision by planners. Yeah, I'll show this later, is the idea that they didn't decide to put certain people in certain camps strategically. And because the enemies of the people were the educated elite, these forced migrations, resettlement, also give us exogenous variations in education levels across locations. At the same time, all takes place, we're going to focus within Russia, where you have no differences in formal institutions. Okay, so let me first give you a little bit more historical background. So the Gulag is the system of forced labor camps scattered across the Soviet Union. It was mostly during Stalin reign, so when he combined terror with industrialization from the 1920s to 1960s. Here you have the total number of prisoners and the total number of camps over time. So you see that it really starts in 1928 with the 5-year plan, Stalin, and then it ends in 1953 with Stalin's death, where the system starts to erode slowly. It reaches its peak in 1952 when you have around 1.7 million prisoners in camps. And you also notice that one of the most extreme period during the Gulag was the Great Terror, also known as the Great Purge in 1937-38, when 1.5 enemies of the people were rounded up and half of them executed. So in the previous graph, you have the total number of prisoners. Here, I just want to show that there's a large share of those prisoners are enemies of the people. Okay, so enemies of the people can also be called counter-revolutionaries, can also be called political prisoners, prisoners that were targeted because they were part of the educated elite. And you see that throughout the Gulag period, they accounted for around 25 to 30% of the total Gulag prisoners. And a consequence of that is that the Gulag is going to have a more educated population than the Soviet Union as a whole. I'll get back to this in a second. A lot of the terror took place in 37 and 38. A lot of the roundups of enemies of the people took place during those 2 years. Okay, 1.5 millions in just 2 years. And just to give you an idea of how terrible this was, there's an extract from a 1937 propaganda. How disgraceful the sight of enemies among us. Shame to the mothers that gave birth to these vicious dogs of unprecedented foulness. This map shows where they were taken from. Okay, so you have the origin of enemies, where they were rounded up. So you see that a lot of them came from around Moscow or St. Petersburg, European Russia, and then they were sent to the big yellow circles, which is the location of the Gulag camps in 1952 at the end of the peak of the Gulag system. So a lot of them were taken from high population density places and sent to remote places, but some of them were also sent to camps that were close or nearby population centers. Okay, so a lot of these roundups took place in Moscow. So you have a historical map from the 1930s, and this is all the roundups that took place, taking doctors, engineers, lawyers, etc., from their apartments to the Gulag. Here's a drawing that shows how it took place. So you have the translation in English at the bottom. It comes from a book by Danzig Baldaev, who was a prison guard during the Gulag system. Okay, and he explains how it took place. We've been instructed to round up 12 enemies of the people. With the engineer, the doctor woman, and the old moron professor, we've only got 10. Take any 2 from the apartments on the first floor, whoever you can get, off you go, off you go. So just shows how the educated elite was targeted, engineers, doctors, professors, but also the randomness in selecting whoever ended up being their neighbors and was part of this social class. Okay, we also know that the educated elite was targeted from historical evidence that looked at what happened when they purged Moscow factories. And it was mostly the managers and the technical specialists that were targeted. They also did purges in rural districts, where it was the heads of local institutions. And then some historians have also looked at the difference across telephone directories, okay, in Moscow and Leningrad or St. Petersburg, before and after the Great Terror, okay, from 1937 and 1939. And what they noticed was that 60% of senior officials from the People's Commissariat of Heavy Industry were missing. So a lot of people disappeared from the phone book. 3% of doctors disappeared, 30% of lawyers disappeared. So heavy targeting of the educated elite. Consequence of this targeting is that the Gulag population is more educated than the USSR as a whole. Okay, so you have the numbers for the USSR as a whole on the last column on the right, census 1939. And in the Gulag is the first column, the same year. Okay, the share of tertiary educated people is 3 times higher in the Gulag at 1.8% than in the population as a whole at 0.6%. We also have some estimates of education within a group of enemies of the people themselves, where as many as 14.7% could have a tertiary education. Okay. So this is true for tertiary education, but it's also true for secondary, primary, and literacy. So can this education really be the can this education level really be caused by enemies of the people? So here we show the correlation across camps between the share of enemies of the people in that camp and the share of tertiary educated and secondary educated in camp. And you see that there's a positive correlation. Okay, so camps with more enemies of the people, also camps with the most educated population. What happened after Stalin's death? Well, the Gulag slowly came to an end, but prisoners often continued working on the same industrial projects. And a lot of these camps became industrial cities. And we know from previous research that being a Gulag was actually a source of city growth in the following years. So one question that comes to mind now is, why did these enemies or prisoners in general remained in those locations when they were free to go? And one reason is that it was always Stalin's plan that no enemy should ever be allowed to return home. Okay, during Gulag times, there were strict limits on mobility known as wolf tickets, so passports that did not allow you to get close to big cities, within 100 kilometers of big cities. Another reason was that managers were actively recruited. Okay, they had gained technical knowledge by working on those Gulag industrial projects, and managers wanted them to stay there. And the third final reason is that Gulags had become a way of life. Okay, there was really no way to return. And this is a quote by a report from the CIA from 1983 that explains how the survivors or the prisoners of the Gulag simply had nowhere to return. Their years of imprisonment had destroyed everything associated with home, family, career, possessions. Millions of survivors just chose to remain. And their liberated presence dramatically changed the demographic, social, and political character of several former admin centers of the Gulag. Okay, so these forced relocations have persistent effect, has transformed the places, the location where they were sent to, as people remained there after they were freed. Just to give you an example here, so if you focus on the top right of the map, you have this group of camps in yellow. Yellow means that there were a lot of enemies of the people in those camps in the Kolyma region. And the port here is a city called Magadan, okay, which was created during Gulag times as a port of access to this Gulag region. And this is how that town was populated. Okay, so they took enemies of the people and other prisoners, they rounded them up, lined them up, took them with nets, put them on ships, on boats. And this is a picture of those boats from a museum in Magadan today. Okay, so prisoners taken on those boats, brought to this region to build roads, and also dig for minerals and other industrial infrastructure projects. Because a large proportion were enemies of the people, the population of Magadan turned out to be highly educated. So here you have the numbers in 1959, about 5 years after the end of the Gulag. And you see that the share of people with tertiary education is much higher in Magadan than in the rest of the Soviet Union, especially among those above 45 years old. So, consequence of this relocation of enemies of the people is you have places where people are highly educated. And this is what the city looks like today, with a lot of businesses of all kinds in all sectors, with wages that are higher on average than in the rest of Russia. Okay, they're around $10,000 a year in Magadan, whereas if you take Russia, the rest of Russia, they're around $5,000 a year. Another example is Vorkuta, which was a gulag in the northwest of Russia, focused on coal mining, also populated by a large number of enemies of the people. This is a view from Google Earth, and you notice on the top left, you see the ruins of the barracks that you can still visit today as part of keeping alive the memory of the Gulag. Okay, but also a town with different kinds of businesses today. And wages, again, higher in Vorkuta than in the rest of Russia.
Pierre-Louis, there's a question from Eli. Eli, please go on.
Yes, I just was wondering how long, do you have any data on how long the prisoners stay in the camp? Because I'm a bit worried about the deterioration of human capital, you know, if they do not work at all for, you know, a decade or so. I mean, it's like, is there any, do you have any data on that?
Well, most of them were taken to camps or rounded up during the Great Terror, so 37, 38. And so they were sent to camps. Sometimes they were sent to different camps during Gulag time. So the Gulag was a universe in perpetual motion. But they stayed, almost all of them, until the end of the system, so until Stalin's death in 1953. And then many of them ended up staying there all their life.
Okay, thanks.
And perhaps the best way to capture why enemies remained even when they were free to go is this quote from Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the book, The Gulag Archipelago. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature for that. It was the first literary account of life in the Gulag. He puts it this way: exile relieved us of the need to choose a place of residence for ourselves, and so from troublesome uncertainties and errors. No place would have been right except that to which they had sent us. Okay, so, question we want to answer is whether the share of enemies in a camp predicts development outcomes today. What data do we use for that? Well, the centerpiece of our paper, of our research, is a camp-level data set on Gulag that tells us how many enemies and how many other prisoners you have in camp. So we collected that from microfilms from the state archives of the Russian Federations in Moscow. So here you have an example. Gives you the number of prisoners by age, by gender, and most importantly, the type of crime or offense that they had committed. And that allows us to identify those who were political prisoners, okay, who were accused under Article 58 of being enemies of the people. Okay, so we use that information to calculate the share of enemies of the people in each camp. So we're going to use data from 1952, a cross-section. It's the peak and the end of the Gulag system. And the reasons for that is that prisoners were constantly shuffled across camp. So it's from a snapshot at the end of the system that we expect to see persistence. Nonetheless, we're also going to use data from 1939, which is right after the Great Terror, where a large number of enemies of the people were sent to gulags as a robustness check. Okay, so the two bars here summarize our cross-section. Okay, the total number of prisoners in 1952 is 1.7 million, and you have around 500,000 enemies of the people. And what this graph shows also is that if you aggregate our numbers, which were taken from microfilms from the archives, you match the aggregates from previous studies from 1993. And so we're going to use this data on Gulag and match it with data on firms. So we have data from Spark, which covers the universe of firms in Russia in 2018. Okay, so it's not just manufacturing, it's everything, services, transportation, retail, everything. Okay, so you have, and we're going to use that firm census to measure wages at the local level. Okay, so we're going to focus only on Gulag locations and try to see if in those locations with a higher share of enemies, wages are higher today. Are places with more enemies among prisoners in 1952 richer today? Before we answer that question, you might say, wait a second, is it really a natural experiment? Maybe your enemies of the people have not been allocated randomly, but rather because they had skills, they sent them to the most productive regions, they sent them to skill-intensive or capital-intensive activities, or maybe they send them to larger camps that benefit from agglomeration economies. And this could explain their effect in the long run rather than being the human capital embedded in them. Okay, so to try to dig a little bit into the determinants of the share of enemies across camps, we can start with remoteness. Okay, so were enemies sent to best places where people already live? So here you have population density into nowadays Russia, but in 1926. And here you have the railroads that existed in 1937. Here you have the camps in 1939. And here you have the camps in 1952. The darker the red, the larger the share of enemies of the people. So it seems already from this map that some camps were in remote locations, while some camps were in urban or heavily populated areas. So let's look at the correlation, what it looks like. If we look across camps, okay, we notice that the share of enemies in a camp increases the further away you move from railway tracks. Okay? The share of enemies is higher in locations where enemies were not rounded up. So it's not like enemies were relocated to camps that were nearby where enemies were taken from. No, they were taken far away from their origin locations. On the top right, the correlation between the share of enemies in a camp and the population within 30 kilometers around that camp. And you notice that there's a negative correlation. So the share of enemies decreases with population. So they were more likely to be sent in places where no one lived. Even half of the camp were in completely virgin lands, okay, where there was absolutely no one before the Gulag started. Okay, and the camps are also further away from big towns. So in general, there's a relationship between what is the share of enemies in a camp and how remote this camp is from pre-Gulag economic activity or population. Another way to think of the natural experiment setting is to look at what historians have written about this. And here's one example from Klevnyuk, who argues that the main purpose of the Great Terror was declared at the very outset to be the physical annihilation of enemies rather than their use as cheap labor. And the political motives for the terror took absolutely priority over economic ones. So it wasn't an allocation of enemies to maximize their output in production. It was to get rid of them because they posed a threat to the stability of the Soviet regime. To confirm that, we can look at the correlation between the share of enemies and the activities that took place in camps. Okay, so the activities, energy, metal industry, forestry, agriculture, mechanical engineering, light manufacturing, research and development. So overall, there is no systematic correlation between what share of enemies ended up in the camp and the activity that took place in that camp. And even for research or research and development activities, the relationship which require employees with technical skills, even in those cases, the share of enemies of the people was not higher. Okay, this is also the case if we focus specifically on construction industries, so no relationship between manufacturing construction and the share of enemies, or housing construction and the share of enemies. It's also reflected in the correlation between enemies and geographic or climate and land variables. So there's more enemies the further east you go and the further north we go, so the more remote you go. There's more enemies in places that have bad soil for agriculture, okay, where rooting and soil workability is worse. Last thing, there's also no correlation between the share of enemies in a camp and whether the camp focuses on the extraction of natural resources or not. We can also look at all those natural resources individually. So you have coal, gold, iron, stone, uranium, tin, calcium, phosphate. So you find maybe a little bit in terms of coal here, but as we show in the paper, it's not robust. And in general, natural resources do not explain the strategic allocation of enemies. Okay, so to investigate this more systematically, we're into a lasso model to see what are the variables that are robust, that predict the share of enemies the best. And we found that the only thing that really matters positively is total camp prisoner population and distance to railways, meaning that remoteness is a predictor, and that the camps that had a lot of enemies were also the biggest camp. So we take these into account. We control for this in our regressions. Okay, and this shows that in both 1939 and 1952, there is indeed a positive correlation between the share of enemies and the total population in the camps. So another quote from a historian on the natural experiment conditions of our study: contrary to long-standing assumptions, arrests in the Soviet Union were never determined by a hypothetic need for forced laborers, but driven by political and ideological consideration. Okay, so you can think of the number of inmates as a basically exogenous variable. So even if it's correlated with the size of the camp, even size of the camps can be considered exogenous. So to recap, the distribution of enemies of cost camp is not driven by Gulag activity. If anything, it's correlated with bad geography and remoteness. So it's not that they were sent to the best places, but rather the worst places. We had a lot of discussions with historians who specialize in Russian contemporary history. They confirmed this, read a bunch of books. None of them mention any enemy allocation rule. The only exceptions are special camps, a handful of special camps created in 1948 and 49, which we also look into in our robustness checks. Okay, so overall, we're going to treat this distribution of enemies across camps as a natural experiment. What question do we want to answer? Across firms within 30 kilometers of gulags, do those around camps with more enemies among prisoners in 1952 pay higher wages today? And this is our baseline results, our main regression table. On the left-hand side, you have the average wage at the firm level. Okay, we look across more than 500,000 firms in the full sample. And we also look at a sample that excludes firms near Moscow as a robustness check. So that's in column 4, 5, 6. Okay, so notice that including controls or not, we find a positive and significant effect of the share of enemies in the camp in 1952 and the wages that firms pay today. What's the magnitude of this effect? Well, if you take a 1 standard deviation increase in the share of enemies, that's a 28 percentage point increase, so quite a large increase. That increases average wages by 22.5%. If you want to think of that in US dollars, well, you can think what would happen to wages in those camps that had only 0 to 10% enemies among prisoners. And in those camps, wages right now are about $5,000 on average. Okay? If all of those prisoners had been enemies, then wages would be around $10,000, so almost double. Okay? So it seems that the share of enemies in the camp has substantial effect on wages today. And what's interesting is that this effect is not driven by specific sectors. Okay, it exists or it's present across all the main sectors of activity, such as manufacturing, information and communication, construction, accommodation and food services, and wholesale and retail trade. So you have a positive and significant effect in a large number of sectors. This result is robust to a bunch of things, okay, excluding special camps, for example, excluding mining towns or mining firms, using 1939 distribution of enemies rather than 1952. So I'm going to skip most of those, but they're summarized in this figure, where you see that across these different specifications, we still find a positive effect, long-term effect of enemies of the people on wages, okay? Whether we include or exclude Moscow, and whether we exclude some camps or region or not. Another robustness check is to just randomly shuffle the enemies across camps, okay, to see if really our results could be found, could happen by chance. Okay? Well, it seems that if you just shuffle them randomly, you never find a positive effect. Okay? And our true effect is much larger than what is possible to obtain by chance. Another question that often comes is that we look only across Gulag, okay, across camps. And we do that because it mimics more closely the conditions of a natural experiment, because we don't need to take into account whether the location of the Gulag itself was endogenous or exogenous, okay, because we only look across Gulag location. But then you can say, what about firms that are not near Gulags? How do these firms compare? And also you could ask, maybe looking only within Gulags is not the right way to do it, because you have a positive effect of this educated elite, of these enemies of the people, but at the same time, you have a negative effect of other prisoners, which are most of the time petty criminals. And so maybe what we're capturing is not the positive effect of human capital, but the negative effect of criminals. So to answer that question, we look at all the firms within Russia and compare those that are not within near a Gulag to those who are near a Gulag, and near Gulags of different enemy intensity. And even there, we found that the firms that pay the highest wages are those that are near Gulags with a high share of enemies, even when our counterfactual includes firms that were not nearby Gulags. So that's a robust effect on wages. We also find a robust effect on net profits per employee. So another way to capture local value added or local prosperity. Again, this effect is significant across a large number of industries, including manufacturing, retail and wholesale trade, finance and banking, etc. It's also robust to using night lights per capita as a measure of local development. So if we look at the intensity of night lights per capita in 2015 in areas of 30 kilometers around camps, you notice that it's brighter, the light intensity is higher near camps that had a higher share of enemies of the people. So what's great with using firm level data and night lights is that you can compare the magnitude. And here we find that the same effect, the same one standard deviation increase in the share of enemies, it increases night lights per capita by 58% and profits per employee by 65%. Okay, so whether we use night lights or profits, we find a similar magnitude of the effect, and average wages increase by 22%. Mechanisms. So is it really enemies of the people that brought their education with them, okay, and then they had children, and then these children had their own children, And throughout the years, you have this intergenerational transmission of human capital that explains why those firms pay higher wages and make more profits today. Okay, so that's the mechanism we have in mind. And to check if it's really the case, we looked at data from the Life and Transition Survey. Okay, so they asked around 51,000 households in ex-USSR countries about their income, their education, their migration. And lucky for us, they also asked people if you or any of members of your family, including your grandparents, were sent to a labor camp or a prison for political reason during the pre-1991 government. Okay, so in other words, we're able to identify those who are the descendants or the relatives of enemies of the people. And what we find if we focus on those who identify as the grandchildren of enemies is that they are more likely to have a tertiary education. Okay, so the grandchildren of enemies are more educated. So that's what the graph on the right shows you the share of people with a higher education among those who identify as the grandchildren of enemies and others. And what's great is that it's not only those grandchildren that are more educated, but it's also their mothers and their fathers, which is in line with intergenerational transmission of human capital. Another question is whether they really did stick around. Okay, so there's a lot of stories that, after the end of the Soviet Union, everybody left, the population started declining. Well, here we look at whether identifying as a grandchild or a relative or an enemy of the people, how that affects your migration decision. And we find that there is no difference between enemy grandchildren and other people, whether they migrated ever in their life or whether they migrated after the fall of the Soviet Union after 1990, there's no statistical difference. Okay, which suggested that enemies of the people and their descendants were not more likely to move away from where they were after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Pierre-Louis, are you talking about international migrants or also people moving internally?
Here in this specification, it's only whether they are presently in a different place than where they were born, but it can be internally. So it's a city level. So it can be internally or externally, but it's just within countries of the ex-Soviet Union. Okay, other exercise of triangulation. We can check if the share of enemies in a camp predicts those who identify as enemies of grandchildren today. So whether a survey respondent is more likely to say, yes, my grandparents were sent to a camp for political reasons, if they live nearby a camp with a higher share of enemies of the people. And we find that this is indeed the case. Okay, so respondents are more likely to be relative of enemies if they are interviewed near a camp that had more enemies in 1950. So some evidence that the education of enemies did persist and that enemies really did stick around. And we can also look at that using census population data. So here the three scatters show the data in 1926 before the relocations, and then in 1959, just after the end of the Gulag, and in 2010. Is the correlation between population and the share of enemies in a camp. Okay, so in 1952, there was a negative relationship between population and enemies of the people. So enemies of the people were sent in more remote places with less people. But this relocation of enemies actually corrected or populated those places, so that in 1959, there was no more difference. Okay, so where you send more enemies, population goes even more. And this flat relationship persisted until 2010. So locations where a lot of enemies were sent to did not suffer from larger declines of population. And you see that if you look at the population levels, but also population growth after the fall of the Soviet Union or in recent years, which is not affected by the share of enemies of the people. Okay, one last mechanism, you could think that it's not driven by the human capital embedded enemies, but it's because Soviet planners, when they saw that there was educated people in some places, they decided to invest more in those places. And if they decided to invest more in those places, that could be driving long-run prosperity rather than the human capital itself. Okay, so we check whether this is the case by looking at whether the share of enemies of the people affects railway investment, the establishment of a science city, okay, so R&D hub, whether it affects the establishment of a defense factory, or whether it affects the establishment of a university. For none of this, we found a positive and significant effect. So it does not seem to be the case that the Soviets invested more where enemies lived, and quite to the contrary, which reinforces our idea that it's more likely to be via human capital than physical capital. What do we do in this paper? So we think of our first contribution in highlighting the prevalence of enemies of the people as Gulag prisoners in one of the darkest episodes of recent history. So to tell you the story of the enemies of the people, we can also think of this paper as a natural experiment where you have forced resettlements that allows us to identify the long-run persistence of human capital or education embedded in forced migrants on prosperity. And this is indeed what we find, that the forced resettlements of enemies of the people is a strong predictor of prosperity today, where they're captured by wages, profits, nightlights, but also the education of the descendants. And that's it for me for today. I'll be really happy to take your questions.
Thanks a lot, Pierre-Louis. So there was a question from Zeki Hernandez.
Yes, thank you, Simone, and thank you, Pierre-Louis. Really interesting. So I think I might be the only non-pure economist in this room. I'm actually in a business school. So I keep thinking how the strategic choices of the firms here that are paying the wages and seeking profits factor into your story. So, one question is, are the location choices of these firms in Russia strategic, intentional? Are they random? I'm sorry, I don't have a very specific question defined, but I'm trying to figure how the choices of the firms factor into your story, either as an explanation or as a way to understand the endogeneity of the results you've shown. Very interesting, thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot for your question. So I guess this is linked to the physical capital investment table that I just saw, but instead of being in Soviet times, it's in recent times. So do firms themselves decide to invest in those places where there's a lot of enemies? To be honest, we didn't look at that. I think it's definitely a possibility, but we thought of it more as, the enemies being there already, their descendants being there already, and making those firms more productive thanks to their human capital, without wondering when the firm was established.
I mean, even if the firm, sorry to jump, even if the firms did make that choice for that reason, that could be very consistent with your story. It would just add a layer of sort of a mechanism to explain what is going on in the present day and how that relates to development. So I don't think it's against what you're finding, but just more understanding what's the explanation.
Yeah.
So there's a question from Alice Bernard.
Yes, so my question is perhaps related to the previous one. So I was wondering if we have any information about the jobs of those enemies of people at the time they are sent to the camps, and perhaps they are not representative of the elite, and imagine they are like the most productive people in terms of long-run effects on growth. Can you have a look at the selection of those people? Also, you would argue that they have been randomly picked, but is it what you can observe with your data if you have some?
So the firm level data doesn't have education level of the employees, which is one thing I guess that could help answer your question. The other one about the self-selection, you mean about comparing the education levels in origin places?
No, the job, the specific occupations of those enemies of people. So if they are musicians or if they are engineers and scientific and perhaps that can speak about some mechanisms and perhaps as well it's related to the question of the firm selection in the more recent period.
We do have some data on the occupations. Do I have it in my appendix here? No. Trying to remember. I mean, it's the idea that having a university level education in general can be a positive thing for firms, even if your occupation or your technical knowledge is not completely in line with the firm you work with. Just being more educated generally leads you to being, care more about processes, organization, management, in ICT skills, language skills, things like that, that allow firms to be more performing, even if the occupations themselves don't match exactly the sectors of the firms.
But you haven't looked at the jobs and so okay, can you say that it's a human capital and does not really matter what you do? And
Eli?
Yeah, I mean, I have a question that is, I think, closely related to the previous ones in the sense that I wonder about how much transferable are those skills across space. I think it's related also to the initial jobs that they do, in the sense that if I am an engineer and I arrive in a very agricultural place, what I'm going to do with those skills. And I think it's a matter of, so I mean, I think it would be nice to link sort of what are the sectors that developed the most and link that with what are the skills, what are the specific skills that those guys brought. Except, I mean, or you have a story about general human capital that I don't know. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you have language, maybe you can also exploit if there are any regional language difference, since you know where they come from, maybe there are some cultural difference or language difference that makes more difficult to transfer those skills. I don't know. That, yeah.
The evidence we have, the historical evidence we have, is that enemies of the people in general were not allowed to work in their occupation or in the best jobs once in the Gulag. They were almost always forced in the worst forced labor jobs. So we don't think of it as necessarily using their skills that they acquired before the Gulags and transferring them to the specific occupation that they did in Gulag times. We think of it more as general human capital, even if there's a possibility that during Gulag times, they ended up, over the years in the position where their skills were most productive. But the initial allocation of these skills or transfers, I don't think is along those lines as transferable skills, but more general skills.
Okay, Giuseppe?
Yes, I think a great paper. I mean, a lot of data that you collected, incredibly. My question is related to the fact that the USSR was a planned economy up to mid-80s and 1991. And it looks like that the places where the enemies of the people were staying started developing before. So does this mean that the planners decided to do that? Or that's my question. But a suggestion would be to look at the change that happened during the market economy period. So look at what happened to the firm between 1991 and 2019. I think these are the data of 2010 that you got there. So to see whether there has been an effect on the change rather than effect on the total wages today.
Yeah, no, that would be great. Obviously, we don't have the firm level data from in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union. There's nightlights. And nightlights, we find an effect even if we go back to 1995. So it may be something that existed already in the aftermath, in the first years of the market economy. But it doesn't seem to have been a conscious decision of planners if we look at the evidence on the physical capital investment, which doesn't seem to have gone to places with a lot of enemies. So it might have happened during market times, but it doesn't seem to be due to planners.
Okay, thanks, Pierre-Louis. Martin?
I wanted to ask you about the spillovers. Have you looked at the descendants of non-enemies of the people, right? But in those locations, whether there can be some role models or educational spillovers over time?
What type of spillovers?
So I'm saying that if you live with people who value education more, even if you are like the grandchildren of a non-enemy of the people, you may want to send your kids to school or that they achieve high.
So spillovers across generation? Sorry, I don't hear you very well.
I can answer. Yeah, Louis, I can answer.
Okay.
Martin, no, we didn't do it, but I think it's a great idea. Basically, what you're saying, we can rerun this one regression where we look at enemies of the people and education, but differentiating between being descendants of the enemies in location with enemies and in location without enemies, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And this will tell us something about the effect of nurture or something like that. It will not be nature, it will be nurture. That's what we didn't do this yet, but I think we can do this. Thanks.
Okay, so Marion?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Pierre-Louis, for this very nice presentation. I just had a question about the mechanism. So you're mostly talking about the intergenerational transmission of human capital. And I was wondering whether you had a chance maybe to look at data on schools or on education infrastructure to provide more evidence on this channel. Maybe this could help you, for instance, to, I don't know, document some heterogeneities between places where there were important or relatively important infrastructures in terms of education and places where there were not.
Mm-hmm. So the only thing we looked at is universities, the location of universities, which is not correlated with enemies. There is the education level, the education data from the census is not at the local level, so we have difficulty finding data on this, but we definitely want to add that to our paper to check more carefully what are the different education outcomes across those locations.
There's another question from Jean Valette. Jérôme, you can go on.
Yeah, my question was related also to the mechanism. So what you have in mind is mostly related to the intergeneral transmission of education. And I was wondering also if you can say something about, because in the end, those cities, they received people, so free labor. And do you see, can you say something about the industrial structure? So is it possible that they took advantage of this free labor to develop a comparative advantage in the industrial production, for instance?
So it's possible, though the share of enemies is not correlated with the industrial structure in Gulag times. This relationship between structure and share of enemies is flat. What did I want to add? Over time, so if we look at industrial structures today, it also doesn't seem that the share of enemies affects industrial structure. Instead, they have positive outcomes across a large number of sectors rather than drive performance within a certain selection of skill-intensive or capital-intensive sectors. So we don't think that the mechanisms here is via industrial structure, whether in the past or today. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, perfect, thanks.
Okay, so it's 6:30. We are on time, and I think that we should call the day. But I would really like to thank again Pierre-Louis and Gerhard for an exciting presentation and for the work that you have shared with us today. Thanks a lot to you and to all of you for having been online with us. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.